When the guns fell silent in June 1967, the Middle East entered a new and uncertain phase. The Six-Day War had lasted less than a week, but its consequences reshaped the region's political and military landscape. Israel had emerged with significant territorial gains. The Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. For Israel, the victory created strategic depth and a sense of military superiority. For much of the Arab world, it was a profound humiliation. The defeat of 1967 was not merely territorial, it was psychological. In Egypt, President Gamal Abdel Nasser faced a crisis of legitimacy. The promise of Arab unity and military strength had collided with a decisive and rapid loss. Though Nasser briefly offered his resignation, mass public demonstrations persuaded him to remain in power. Yet beneath the surface, the Egyptian military began a period of reassessment. Across the Suez Canal, Israeli forces established defensive lines along the eastern bank. The most prominent of these was the Bar-Lev Line, a system of fortifications, sand embankments, and strong points designed to deter any Egyptian attempt to cross the canal. It symbolized a new reality. Israel now stood on the western edge of Sinai, only a waterway away from Egypt's heartland. But the war had not resolved the core dispute. Instead, it hardened positions. In August 1967, Arab leaders met in Khartoum and adopted what became known as a three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. The declaration reflected anger and defiance, but it also signaled that diplomatic resolution would not come easily. Between 1968 and 1970, tensions flared again in what became known as a war of attrition. Egypt, seeking to regain leverage, launched artillery barrages and limited military actions along the Suez Canal. Israel responded with airstrikes deep into Egyptian territory. The fighting was less dramatic than 1967, but it was costly and persistent. The war of attrition revealed a key lesson. Israel's overwhelming victory in 1967 did not guarantee long-term stability. In 1970, a shift in leadership altered the trajectory of events. Gamal Abdel Nasser died unexpectedly. He was succeeded by Anwar Sadat, a leader initially underestimated by both allies and adversaries. Many observers viewed Sadat as a transitional figure. Few anticipated that he would reshape Egyptian strategy. Sadat faced a strategic dilemma. Egypt's economy was strained. The Sinai remained under Israeli control. The Arab world's prestige had not recovered. Diplomatic efforts to regain territory through negotiation had yielded little progress. Sadat concluded that a limited war might succeed where diplomacy had stalled. His objective was not necessarily total military victory. Rather, it was to break the stalemate, shatter the perception of Israeli invincibility, and force international powers, particularly the United States, to engage seriously in negotiations. To achieve this, Egypt needed preparation and coordination. Meanwhile, Syria had its own motivations. The loss of the Golan Heights in 1967 remained a source of strategic vulnerability and national resentment. Syrian leadership under Hafez al-Assad began strengthening its military capabilities with Soviet support. Throughout the early 1970s, Egypt and Syria increased coordination. Military training intensified. Soviet advisors supplied advanced surface-to-air missile systems and modern equipment. Egyptian forces developed detailed plans for crossing the Suez Canal under heavy defensive conditions. The element of surprise became central to strategy. Israeli intelligence, however, operated under prevailing assumption known informally as the concept. It held that Egypt would not initiate war until it had achieved air superiority sufficient to challenge Israel's air force directly. Since such capability had not yet been fully realized, many Israeli analysts believed a large-scale Egyptian attack was unlikely. This assumption would prove critical. Throughout 1973, warning signs appeared. Troop movements were observed. Military exercises increased in frequency. Diplomatic tensions rose. Yet Israeli leadership interpreted these signals within the framework of previous experience. Similar mobilizations in earlier years had not resulted in war. In Egypt and Syria, planning continued. A joint offensive was scheduled for October 6, 1973, a date chosen carefully. It coincided with Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, when much of Israel will be observing religious fasting and national quiet. It also fell during Ramadan, a significant period in the Muslim calendar. The symbolic weight of the date amplified the strategic intent. On the eve of the attack, the Middle East appeared tense but not on the brink of immediate war. Diplomatic channels remained open. Public rhetoric was measured. Yet behind the scenes, mobilized armies prepared for coordinated assault. The legacy of 1967 lingered in every calculation. For Israel, the confidence gained from rapid victory shaped defensive planning. For Egypt and Syria, the memory of defeat fueled determination. For the superpowers, the region remained potential flashpoint in the Cold War balance. On October 6, 1973, at approximately 2 p.m., Egyptian artillery opened fire along the Suez Canal. The Yom Kippur War had begun.
On the afternoon of October 6, 1973, silence along the Suez Canal was shattered by one of the most coordinated artillery barrages in modern Middle Eastern history. At precisely 2 p.m., Egyptian forces opened fire across the length of the canal. More than 2,000 artillery pieces, mortars, and rocket launchers targeted Israeli fortifications along the Bar-Lev line. Within minutes, the defensive positions that had symbolized Israel's post-1967 security were engulfed in smoke and fire. The timing was deliberate. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Many Israeli soldiers were on leave. Civilian activity was minimal. Radio and television broadcasts were suspended. Roads were largely empty. The element of surprise was nearly complete. Under cover of the artillery barrage, Egyptian assault units began crossing the Suez Canal. Inflatable boats carried the first waves of infantry across the water. Engineers followed with portable bridges and high-pressure water cannons designed to breach the massive sand embankments of the Bar-Lev line. The innovation was critical. For years, Israeli planners believed the steep sand ramparts along the canal would delay any crossing long enough for reserves to mobilize. Egyptian engineers used powerful water pumps to carve openings through the embankments within hours, a solution both simple and effective. By evening, thousands of Egyptian troops had established bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the canal. Anti-aircraft missile batteries, moved forward in coordination with the assault, created protective umbrella that limited Israeli air operations. This was a key difference from 1967. Egyptian strategy focused on denying Israeli air superiority near the front lines. Israeli forward units, lightly manned and unprepared for such a large-scale assault, struggled to contain the crossings. Calls for reinforcements were urgent. Mobilization orders were issued nationwide, but reserve mobilization required time. Meanwhile, on the northern front, Syrian forces launched a simultaneous offensive against the Golan Heights. The Syrian assault involved hundreds of tanks and thousands of troops advancing across fortified lines. Unlike the surprise achieved in Sinai in 1967, Israel now faced a sudden defensive struggle. The Golan Heights, though strategically advantageous to whoever held them, required constant vigilance. Israeli forces stationed there were limited in number. When Syrian armored divisions began their advance, the scale of the attack quickly became apparent. Within hours, intense tank battles erupted across the plateau. Israeli defensive units, heavily outnumbered, fought to slow the Syrian advance. Communications were strained. Reports from the front indicated that some positions had fallen. In certain sectors, Syrian forces penetrated deeply into the heights. The psychological shock inside Israel was profound. The confidence that followed the Six-Day War had fostered a belief in military readiness and rapid dominance. Now, in both the south and the north, Israeli forces were reacting rather than initiating. In Sinai, Egyptian troops consolidated their positions within a limited distance east of the canal. Crucially, they did not immediately push deep into the desert. Instead, they remained within the protective range of their surface-to-air missile systems. This restraint reflected a deliberate strategic calculation. Egypt's objective was not to conquer all of Sinai immediately. It was to establish a foothold strong enough to alter political dynamics and demonstrate that the post-1967 status quo was reversible. In the Golan, however, Syria aimed for deeper territorial gains. Syrian armored units advanced toward key intersections and observation points. For a brief period, it appeared possible that they might break through to the Jordan River Valley. Israeli commanders faced difficult choices. Reserves were redirected urgently to the northern front. Air sorties intensified despite the risk posed by advanced missile systems supplied by the Soviet Union. Casualties mounted. By the night of October 6th and into October 7th, the scale of the crisis became unmistakable. Israeli intelligence had failed to anticipate the timing and coordination of the attack. The prevailing assumption that Egypt would not strike without overwhelming air capability had proven flawed. The war had begun not with Israeli initiative, but with Israeli vulnerability. Yet the conflict was far from decided. Mobilization continued throughout the country. Civilian volunteers supported logistical operations. Reserve brigades moved toward both fronts. The first 48 hours of the Yom Kippur War belonged largely to Egypt and Syria, but wars are rarely determined in their opening moments. The coming days would test whether the surprise achieved on October 6 could be sustained, or whether Israel's capacity for rapid adaptation would once again reshape the battlefield. While Egyptian forces consolidated their bridgeheads along the Suez Canal, the northern front entered a far more fluid and dangerous phase. On the Golan Heights, the situation during the first 24 hours was precarious. Syrian forces committed multiple armored divisions supported by mechanized infantry and artillery. Estimates suggest that Syria deployed over 1,000 tanks across the front. Opposing them were significantly fewer Israeli armored units, many of them reservists who had not yet fully mobilized. The terrain shaped the battle. The Golan Heights is a plateau rising sharply from surrounding valleys. Whoever controls the heights commands visibility and artillery advantage. Defensive positions were established after 1967, but they depended on rapid reinforcement in the event of full-scale war. When Syrian armored columns advanced on October 6, Israeli forward units absorbed the initial shock. Tank battles erupted almost immediately. In sectors such as the Valley of Tays, later named for the intensity of fighting, Israeli armored brigade confronted overwhelming numbers. The engagement was not static trench warfare. It was fluid, mobile and chaotic. Tanks maneuvered across open ground under constant artillery and anti-tank fire. Communication was critical. Israeli commanders relied on decentralized initiative. Individual tank crews often made rapid decisions without waiting for higher command directives. The goal was not immediate victory. It was delay. Every hour mattered. Reserve units were mobilizing across Israel. Civilian life had halted. Soldiers were transported directly from synagogues and homes to the front lines. The ability to hold defensive positions for even 24 to 48 hours could determine whether the northern front collapsed or stabilized. Syrian forces initially achieved penetration in several sectors. Some Israeli outposts were overrun. Observation points fell. For a brief period, the possibility that Syrian units might break through to the Sea of Galilee seemed real. The psychological dimension intensified. For Israel, the memory of 1967 had reinforced confidence. Now, under coordinated assault from two fronts, vulnerability was evident. The speed of the Syrian advance challenged assumptions about readiness and deterrence. Yet several factors began to alter the balance. First, Israeli air power, though constrained by Syrian and Egyptian surface-to-air missile systems, gradually increased effectiveness in the north. Unlike the dense Egyptian missile umbrella in Sinai, Syrian air defense networks were less integrated. This allowed limited but growing Israeli air operations. Second, terrain familiarity favored defenders. Israeli commanders had trained extensively on the Golan. Defensive positions were known intimately. As Syrian armored units pushed deeper, they extended supply lines and entered zones of concentrated Israeli fire. By October 8th, Reserve Armored Brigade began arriving in strength. Counterattacks intensified. Tank engagements often occurred at close range, sometimes within a few hundred meters. Ammunition resupply became urgent. Crews operated with minimal rest. Smoke, burning vehicles, and wreckage covered the battlefield. Gradually, Syrian momentum slowed. Israeli units exploited interior lines of movement, reinforcing threatened sectors quickly. Concentrated firepower, coordinated artillery, and local counterattacks disrupted Syrian advances. The battle reached its turning point when Israeli forces stabilized key ridgelines and regained control of critical road junctions. By October 9th, Syrian armored formations began withdrawing toward their original lines. But the fighting did not end at the pre-war ceasefire boundary. Israeli leadership faced a decision: halt at the original line or push deeper into Syrian territory to reduce future threat. The decision favored advance. Israeli forces moved beyond the 1967 ceasefire line toward Damascus. Artillery positions were targeted. Syrian defensive depth was tested. At this stage, the conflict risked broader escalation. Syria was closely aligned with the Soviet Union. As Israeli forces approached within artillery range of Damascus, Moscow signaled concern. The Northern Front was no longer a purely regional battlefield. It had strategic implications. By mid-October, the Golan Front had shifted from defensive survival to offensive leverage. The initial shock of October 6 had been absorbed. Israeli forces had not only prevented collapse, they had reversed the advance. Yet the cost was high. The intensity of tank warfare on the Golan demonstrated the lethality of modern armored combat under missile and artillery threat. It also revealed how rapidly battlefield momentum can change when reserves, coordination, and morale intersect. While the Northern Front stabilized and reversed, the Southern Front in Sinai was approaching its own decisive phase. There, the dynamics were different. Egypt had achieved its initial objective. But whether it could hold that objective and whether Israel could break the stalemate remained unresolved. While the northern front began to stabilize after days of brutal tank warfare, the southern front along the Suez Canal entered a more complex and decisive phase. By October 8, Israeli commanders attempted an immediate counterattack in Sinai. The effort was premature. Egyptian forces, entrenched within their missile umbrella, repelled the assault. Israeli armored units suffered significant losses against well-prepared anti-tank positions and coordinated artillery fire. The message was clear. This would not be 1967. Egyptian planning had been methodical. Rather than advancing deep into Sinai and exposing themselves to air superiority, Egyptian forces remained within 10 to 15 kilometers east of the canal, close enough to benefit from surface-to-air missile coverage. President Anwar Sadat's objective had been achieved in part. Egyptian troops had crossed the canal, breached the Balev line, and demonstrated that Israeli defenses were not impenetrable. The psychological barrier of 1967 had been broken, yet strategy now diverged between Cairo and Damascus. Syria, under heavy Israeli counterpressure on the Golan, urged Egypt to expand its offensive eastward to relieve northern pressure. Under political and military coordination pressures, Egyptian leadership approved a limited armored advance beyond missile protection. This decision would prove critical. On October 14th, Egyptian armored units pushed eastward into open desert terrain. Unlike the fortified canal zone, this battlefield favored mobility and air engagement. Israeli forces, regrouped and reinforced, were prepared. The result was a large-scale armored confrontation in central Sinai. Israeli units, leveraging improved coordination and aerial support where possible, engaged Egyptian columns in maneuver warfare. Without the dense missile shield, Egyptian formations became more vulnerable to Israeli airstrikes and anti-tank tactics. The offensive stalled. The Egyptian advance did not achieve its intended operational breakthrough. Instead, it exposed gaps between Egyptian army's position along the canal. Israeli command recognized an opportunity. General Ariel Sharon and other commanders proposed a bold maneuver: exploit the seam between Egypt's 2nd and 3rd armies, cross the Suez Canal to the West Bank, and encircle Egyptian forces from behind. The plan carried high risk. Crossing the canal in reverse meant entering Egyptian territory. It also risked direct confrontation with forces deep inside Egypt and heightened Soviet concern. But it offered the possibility of shifting the war's momentum decisively. On the night of October 15th to 16th, Israeli engineering units began constructing pontoon bridges under fire. Armored units crossed narrow crossing points south of the Great Bitter Lake. The operation required precision, coordination, and speed. Fighting intensified around what became known as the Chinese Farm, a misidentified agricultural station that became a focal point of heavy combat. Egyptian units resisted fiercely. Casualties mounted on both sides. Supply routes were contested. Yet gradually, Israeli forces established a bridgehead west of the canal. Once across, Israeli armor advanced north and south, targeting Egyptian supply lines. The encirclement of the Egyptian Third Army began to take shape. The strategic implications were immense. For the first time in the war, Israeli forces were positioned on the west bank of the canal, threatening the rear of Egyptian armies. Cairo itself was within operational reach. International alarm escalated rapidly. The Soviet Union, observing the encirclement of its allies' forces, signaled strong concern. Diplomatic messages intensified between Moscow and Washington. The possibility of direct superpower involvement, however remote, entered discussion. The United States responded by increasing military resupply to Israel through a massive airlift operation. Soviet shipments to Egypt and Syria accelerated in parallel. The regional war was approaching global significance. By October 22nd, a United Nations brokered ceasefire was proposed. Fighting continued intermittently as both sides sought favorable positioning before the ceasefire took hold. When the guns finally fell largely silent, Israeli forces had encircled the Egyptian Third Army east of the canal and maintained positions west of it. The southern front had transformed from defensive shock to offensive leverage. Egypt had achieved its initial political objective, restoring national pride and demonstrating military capability. Israel had regained operational dominance and shifted the battlefield dynamic. But the war's outcome would not be measured solely in territory. The superpower dimension, the oil embargo, and the diplomatic reshaping of Middle Eastern alliances would define the next phase. The battlefield in Sinai had reversed direction. The conflict now moved from tanks and bridges to diplomacy and global tension. By mid-October 1973, the Yom Kippur War had expanded beyond regional conflict. The battlefield developments in Sinai and the Golan Heights were no longer isolated military events. They had become part of a larger Cold War equation. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were deeply invested politically, strategically, and symbolically. From the beginning of the war, Washington and Moscow had monitored events closely. The Middle East was not merely a regional theater. It was a zone of influence where prestige and credibility were at stake. When Egypt and Syria launched their coordinated attack on October 6, the Soviet Union was initially cautious. Though it had supplied equipment and advisors, Moscow avoided direct engagement. However, as the war intensified and Israeli forces began reversing early gains, particularly after crossing to the west bank of the Suez Canal, the situation grew more volatile. The encirclement of Egypt's Third Army created a diplomatic emergency. For President Anwar Sadat, the initial crossing of the canal had achieved political success. But the risk of catastrophic military defeat if the Third Army collapsed could undo those gains. Egypt urgently sought Soviet diplomatic intervention. In Moscow, leaders face a dilemma. Allowing a close ally's army to be destroyed would damage Soviet credibility in the Arab world. Yet direct military intervention risked confrontation with the United States. Meanwhile, in Washington, the administration of President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger viewed the war through a strategic lens. The United States had initiated a massive resupply effort, Operation Nickel Grass, airlifting tanks, ammunition, and equipment to Israel. The operation was conducted at high tempo and with significant visibility. This airlift reinforced Israel's ability to sustain offensive operations, but it also signaled American commitment. As Israeli forces approached deeper positions west of the canal and threatened encircled Egyptian units, Moscow increased diplomatic pressure. Messages exchanged between the superpowers became urgent. On October 24th, the situation escalated sharply. The Soviet Union proposed sending joint U.S. Soviet forces to enforce a ceasefire. When Washington rejected the idea, Soviet leadership hinted that it might act unilaterally to prevent the collapse of Egyptian forces. The United States responded decisively. American military forces were placed on DEFCON 3, an elevated state of nuclear readiness. Strategic bombers were alerted. Naval forces in the Mediterranean were repositioned. This was the highest state of alert since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Though nuclear war was not imminent, the symbolism was unmistakable. A regional conflict had triggered superpower military posture shifts. Behind the scenes, intense diplomacy continued. Kissinger engaged in rapid shuttle diplomacy between capitals. The objective was stabilization, not victory. Eventually, a ceasefire under United Nations Resolution 338 took hold. Israeli forces maintained their positions. The Egyptian Third Army remained encircled but not destroyed. Negotiations began regarding humanitarian supply routes and disengagement. The war had revealed a fundamental truth. Local conflicts in the Cold War era could rapidly approach global confrontation. Yet military tension was only part of the global shock. In parallel with battlefield developments, Arab oil-producing nations made a strategic decision that would reverberate worldwide. In October 1973, members of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo against nations perceived as supporting Israel, most notably the United States and several Western European states. Oil production was reduced. Exports were curtailed. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Global oil prices quadrupled within months. Fuel shortages spread across Western economies. Lines formed at gas stations. Inflation surged. The economic consequences were severe and prolonged. The Yom Kippur War had thus reshaped not only military balances, but global economics. Energy became a strategic weapon. Western governments reassessed foreign policy priorities in the Middle East. The importance of stable access to oil transformed diplomatic calculations. The conflict demonstrated that regional wars could influence global markets and domestic politics thousands of miles away. For the Soviet Union, the war reinforced both opportunity and limitation. Moscow had demonstrated influence but avoided direct confrontation. For the United States, the crisis confirmed that regional allies required reliable support, but also careful management to prevent escalation. The superpower dimension of the Yom Kippur War did not produce direct combat between Washington and Moscow, but it came close enough to reshape strategic thinking. Nuclear deterrence had again framed decision-making. Restraint prevailed, not because tensions were absent, but because consequences were understood. As ceasefire lines stabilized and negotiations began, it became clear that the war's true impact would unfold in diplomacy. The battlefield had reached equilibrium. The geopolitical consequences were only beginning.
When the ceasefire finally began to hold in late October 1973, the battlefield had reached a tense equilibrium. Israeli forces stood west of the Suez Canal, having encircled Egypt's Third Army. Egyptian troops remained on the eastern bank, having successfully breached what was once considered an impenetrable defensive line. On the Golan Heights, Israeli forces had pushed Syrian units back and advanced beyond the pre-war ceasefire line. Militarily, the war ended without a clear, absolute victor. Politically, however, the outcome was transformative. For Egypt, the crossing of the Suez Canal had restored national confidence. The humiliation of 1967 had been partially reversed. Even though Israeli forces later regained operational dominance, the psychological balance had shifted. President Anwar Sadat could now claim that Egypt had fought effectively and altered the strategic equation. For Israel, the war shattered assumptions. The intelligence failure of October 6 exposed the dangers of complacency. The belief that deterrence alone could prevent coordinated attack proved flawed. The early days of vulnerability left a deep imprint on Israeli society and military doctrine. In the months that followed, internal investigations examined the intelligence and political decisions that preceded the war. Public debate intensified. Leadership changes followed. Yet the war also opened diplomatic space that had previously seemed unreachable. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger initiated a series of shuttle diplomacy missions between Jerusalem, Cairo, and Damascus. These negotiations focused first on military disengagement, reducing the risk of renewed hostilities. In January 1974, the Sinai Disengagement Agreement was signed between Israel and Egypt. Israeli forces withdrew west of the canal. Buffer zones were established under United Nations supervision. Later agreements further reduced troop concentrations along contested lines. Gradually, a shift in regional diplomacy became visible. Sadat had concluded that limited war had achieved its purpose. The stalemate of 1967 was broken. The superpowers were engaged. Negotiation now seemed possible from a position of regained credibility. In a move that stunned much of the Arab world, Sadat took an unprecedented step in 1977. He traveled to Jerusalem and addressed the Israeli parliament. The gesture signaled a fundamental strategic realignment. It was not merely symbolic. It reflected a deeper calculation that continued confrontation would drain Egypt's economy and prolong instability, while negotiated peace could recover territory and improve international standing. These efforts culminated in the Camp David Accords of 1978, mediated by U.S. President Jimmy Carter. The agreement laid the groundwork for the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty. Under its terms, Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula in stages. In return, Egypt recognized Israel and established diplomatic relations. The Sinai, lost in 1967 and contested in 1973, was eventually returned through negotiation rather than force. The Yom Kippur War thus reshaped not only military balances, but diplomatic trajectories. It demonstrated that limited war could alter political realities without total victory. It reinforced the centrality of superpower mediation in regional conflicts, and it confirmed that battlefield outcomes alone could not resolve long-standing disputes. Yet not all fronts moved toward resolution. Syria did not achieve a comparable agreement. The Golan Heights remained contested. The Palestinian question, increasingly central since 1967, continued to define regional politics. Armed struggle, uprisings, and negotiations would characterize the decades ahead. The war also left a broader strategic legacy. Globally, the oil embargo altered economic policy and energy planning in Western nations. The Cold War balance in the Middle East shifted towards stronger U.S. influence. Military doctrines worldwide reassessed the role of anti-tank weapons, surface-to-air missiles, and armored maneuver. Perhaps most importantly, the war demonstrated the fragility of perceived stability. In 1967, confidence had seemed absolute. In October 1973, surprise overturned assumptions within hours. The Yom Kippur War lasted less than 3 weeks. But it changed how leaders calculated risk. It changed how intelligence was evaluated. It changed how diplomacy was pursued. It was a war of shock, recovery, escalation, and restraint. A war that began in surprise. A war that nearly drew in superpowers. A war that ultimately opened the path to the first Arab-Israeli peace treaty. The Middle East after October 1973 was not the same as before, and the lessons of those weeks continue to influence regional strategy to this day.